The clock had a second hand that moved the way a person tries not to be noticed. It ticked once, then waited, then ticked again, as if it was listening for permission. Somewhere close, a kettle was settling after a boil, giving off small metallic clicks in the quiet. A door hinge complained softly, and then fell still. A pencil scraped paper, stopped, scraped again, stopped again, like the writer was copying something they didn't fully trust. The air carried the smell of damp wool and smoke that had been in fabric too long to ever leave. A man near the wall kept rolling the same match between his fingers without striking it. The tiny cylinder made a dry, papery sound each time it turned. Every few seconds he looked toward the same corner of the room, then away like he didn't want to be caught expecting something. Another man sat with his cap in his lap, smoothing the brim with his thumb again and again. The motion so practiced it could have belonged to any afternoon that wasn't this one. The room was not silent, not truly. It was full of restrained noises that pretended to be normal. A radio somewhere gave up a faint, tired hiss, and then nothing, and then hiss again, like it couldn't decide whether it was alive. Pipes carried water through a wall and made a distant rushing sound, as if the building itself was trying to remind everyone that ordinary things still happened. Someone cleared his throat. Nobody looked up. A hand reached for a cup, lifted it, set it down without drinking. A chair leg shifted an inch on the floor and left a thin, dragging mark in the dust. A page was turned carefully, the paper soft from being handled too much, and then turned back, as if the information on it might change if looked at twice. The clock kept making its small declarations. There was a window, but the light that came through it did not feel like daylight. It was flat, hesitant, filtered by weather or smoke or both. It made the faces in the room look unfinished, as if they were still deciding what expression to wear. Eyes moved without meeting. Mouths opened and closed on words that didn't come out. A low voice said something that sounded like reassurance. Another voice answered with a short laugh that wasn't amused. A third voice, quieter, repeated the same sentence it had already said before, as if repetition could make it true. The words weren't important enough to hold on to, the way people talk when the talking is meant to keep the edges of fear from showing. The match rolled again between fingers, never struck. In the corner, on a table that had been wiped too many times, a small stack of papers sat perfectly aligned, waiting to be disturbed. The top sheet had a crease down the middle, like it had been folded in haste and flattened again with care. A thin smear of ink on one margin suggested someone had pressed too hard, or paused too long, or both. A man stood, took 2 steps, and stopped as if he had reached an invisible boundary. He listened. Everyone listened, though nobody acknowledged they were listening. The building offered nothing but its own quiet, a settling beam, a distant drip, the faint rattle of something loose in a vent. Then, from farther away, a sound arrived that didn't belong to the room's routine. It wasn't loud, not yet. It was the kind of sound that could be mistaken for wind if you wanted it to be. The kind of sound that could be ignored if you had practice ignoring. Someone glanced at the clock, and the motion spread through the room like a thought nobody wanted to claim. The second hand moved. It kept moving. It didn't slow down for anyone. The pencil scratched again, faster this time, like the writer had suddenly remembered what time was. Outside the window, the flat light shifted by a shade, almost imperceptibly, as if the world had leaned closer. And the clock went on, calmly counting down the minutes no one took seriously, because there were not many left. The first name anyone spoke was the day's, not a person's. Tuesday, a clerk said quietly, as if the word itself could anchor the room. He wrote it at the top of a logbook in careful block letters, then underlined it once, then stared at the underline like it might tell him whether to draw a second one. The logbook was old enough to have absorbed years of fingertips, the corners polished by repetition. The clerk's sleeve was rolled to the elbow. There was a faint ring of damp on the paper where his wrist had rested. A corridor ran outside the room, and beyond that, a larger building that worked the way it always worked, even when it shouldn't have. Boots passed at measured intervals. Somewhere, a typewriter started, paused, started again. A telephone rang once and then was lifted before it could ring a second time, like the sound itself was considered wasteful. In a distant office, a voice read out numbers in a steady cadence, and another voice repeated them back, slower, as if the act of repeating was proof that the message had been received. The men in the room were not commanders. They were not the ones who would be remembered in memoirs. They were the hands that kept the machine fed with paper, ink, and the smallest kind of obedience. A map lay on the table, held flat by a metal ruler and a coffee tin with its label worn away. The map looked clean from a distance, but up close it was crowded with pencil marks, small corrections, erasures that left pale scars in the fibers. A smudge near one edge showed where someone had traced the same route more than once, not because it changed, but because the mind needed the reassurance of familiar lines. A man at the window adjusted the blackout curtain by half an inch, then let it fall back, dissatisfied. The light outside remained dull and reluctant. It made the glass look thick, like it was holding the world at arm's length. "Any change?" someone asked. Not to anyone in particular. "No change," came the answer, too quick, as if speed could substitute for certainty. There was a routine to these hours. There was always a routine. Messages arrived, were stamped, copied, sent along. The stamps thudded softly, like small hammers tapping nails into place. A runner came in with a slip of paper, waited while a sergeant read it, then took it back out without a word. The runner's cheeks were red from the cold, or from the wind, or from something he didn't name. On the wall, a schedule board listed shifts in chalk. Next to one name, someone had erased and rewritten the time, then erased again, then written it once more in heavier strokes. Under the board, a coat rack held damp wool and leather straps that creaked when touched. The coat smelled of rain and tobacco and the faint sourness of long days. At the far end of the table, a radio operator sat with his headphones around his neck. He kept one hand resting on the receiver as if it might try to escape. His fingers were ink-stained from copying transmissions. Every few minutes he leaned forward, listened, and then leaned back again. The same motion repeated until it began to look like a prayer. "Signals are thin," he said once, and nobody responded, because thin signals were not new. Thin signals could be blamed on weather, on distance, on equipment, on anything but the possibility that the air itself was changing. A pot of coffee sat near the stove, dark and overcooked. Cups were filled and set down half full. Someone tore a piece of bread, chewed without tasting, and kept his eyes on the map like the lines might begin to move. A man with a small notebook made lists that were not necessary, because making lists felt like control. He wrote pencils, lamps, batteries. Then he wrote the same items again on a fresh page, neater this time. In the corner, a young corporal tried to lighten the room with the smallest kind of joke, something about the cook and the taste of the coffee. Two men smiled out of politeness. Nobody laughed. The corporal's grin lingered too long on his face, then dropped away when he realized it hadn't landed. He looked down at his boots, scuffed and wet, and wiped at a spot of mud that wouldn't come off. A door opened, and an officer stepped in, carrying the air of another room with him. He was not high-ranking, but he had enough authority that conversations bent around him. He nodded once, not greeting anyone, just acknowledging the space. He placed a folder on the table and tapped it with 2 fingers. "These are the latest," he said. The folder was thick with paper. It made a sound like compressed breath when it hit the wood. The clerk reached for it but hesitated, waiting for permission that never came and never needed to. He opened it anyway. Pages inside were marked with stamps and signatures, the ink a shade darker than the rest, as if the official words had more weight. As the pages were turned, the room tried to continue being normal. A man refilled the oil lamp. Another straightened the ruler on the map, aligning it to a grid line with unnecessary precision. A cigarette was lit, and the flame briefly illuminated a face, revealing the tightness around the eyes before the match was shaken out and the expression returned to neutrality. Outside, somewhere beyond the building, engines idled, not revving, not roaring, just running as if they had been started early to be ready, as if readiness alone was a virtue. The sound threaded through the walls and settled in the room's bones. "Still on schedule," the officer said, as if reading the phrase aloud could preserve it. "Good," someone replied, and the word landed flat. The radio hissed. The operator lifted his headphones, put them on, listened. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in alarm, but in the focused way of someone straining to make sense of faint sound. "Repeat," he murmured into the microphone, his voice careful, almost gentle. He waited. The room waited with him, pretending not to. Then he took the headphones off again, slowly, and set them down as if they were fragile. He didn't speak right away. His silence drew attention in a way speech did not. "What?" the sergeant asked, keeping his tone light like he was asking about coffee. "Nothing," the operator said. "Just static." The word static was familiar. Static meant the world was ordinary and inconvenient, not dangerous. Static was something you could blame and move past. The clerk wrote it down anyway, just in case. Static at 10:17. He underlined the time. At a different desk, a man with wire-rim glasses folded a telegram and unfolded it again, reading it as if it might reveal a hidden line. He ran his thumb along the edge, smoothing it, then looked up at the map with the same tired devotion. His mouth moved slightly, rehearsing a sentence he did not speak. The air in the room felt too still for a building full of working men. It had the quality of a held breath. Yet everything continued. The stamps, the pencils, the murmured acknowledgments, the small lies of routine. Someone said, "It'll hold," with the kind of confidence that belonged to habit, not evidence. Someone else answered, "Of course," because of course was easier than asking. The clock on the wall did not care about reassurance. It did not care about schedules or folders or chalkboards. It kept moving second by second, stretching the morning into something that felt longer than it should have been. And outside, the engines kept idling, patient, as if they had all the time in the world. The first sign was a delay so small it barely deserved a name. A message that usually arrived at the same minute each hour came 2 minutes late. When it did arrive, the paper was warmer than expected, like it had been held too long in someone's hand. The runner who delivered it stood a moment longer than necessary, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, then left without waiting to be dismissed. No one commented. 2 minutes meant nothing. 2 minutes could be blamed on stairs, on a misplaced pen, on a man stopping to tie his boot. The clerk glanced at the clock, hesitated, then wrote the time as if it were ordinary. He did not underline it. At the radio desk, the operator adjusted a dial by a fraction, then another fraction, chasing clarity that never quite came. The hiss thickened, thinned, thickened again. Somewhere beneath it, there was the suggestion of a voice, or perhaps that was only the mind wanting one. He leaned closer, his shoulder brushing the edge of the table. "Say again." He spoke softly, even though no one had asked him to. The reply, if there was one, dissolved into static. He took off the headphones and rubbed the bridge of his nose, leaving a faint smudge of ink on his skin. When he looked up, he met the clerk's eyes for a brief second. Neither of them spoke. The look passed, unrecorded. A pencil broke with a quiet snap. The sound was sharp enough to turn heads, then just as quickly forgotten. The man who held it cursed under his breath and reached for another, sharpening it with a small knife. The blade scraped wood in steady strokes. Curl after curl fell to the floor, pale and useless. At the window, the blackout curtain moved slightly, stirred by air that hadn't been there before. The man standing there frowned, checked the frame, then let it be. Buildings shifted. Curtains moved. That was not a sign of anything. From down the corridor came a raised voice, then a laugh that cut off too suddenly. Footsteps followed, faster than usual, then slowed as they passed the door, adopting the building's careful pace. The room absorbed the sound and returned to its muted rhythm. "Any update?" someone asked again. "Not yet," came the answer, a shade less certain than before. On the map, a thin red line had been drawn earlier that morning, neat and confident. Now a fingertip hovered over it, tracing the path without touching. The man tracing it had a habit of counting under his breath. His lips moved. 1, 2, 3. He stopped at a junction and frowned as if the paper had offended him. "That road's still clear," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "It was an hour ago," another man replied, and meant it as reassurance. The word was an hour ago, not is. A second telegram arrived, this one creased and smudged, the ink slightly blurred as if it had been written in haste or damp. The clerk read it once, then again, then set it aside rather than placing it in the usual stack. He told himself he would file it properly in a moment. He told himself there was no reason to interrupt anyone yet. Across the room, a lamp flickered. Just once. The man nearest it adjusted the wick, annoyed, and the light steadied. "Old wiring," he muttered. "Old buildings did that." The radio operator tried again. He caught a fragment this time, a handful of syllables tangled in noise. It was enough to make his jaw tighten, not enough to make sense of. He wrote something on his pad, then crossed it out so hard the paper tore. When he rewrote it, the word was more cautious, the phrasing less certain. "What was that?" the sergeant asked, not looking up. "Interference," the operator said, choosing the safest word available. The sergeant nodded, satisfied. Interference was technical. Interference was manageable. A man near the door checked his watch and frowned, then adjusted the strap as if that might correct the time. He leaned toward the officer with the folder. "If they don't report in soon, they will," the officer said, cutting him off gently. "They always do." The sentence ended the conversation. Always was doing a lot of work in that room. Outside, the sound of engines changed. Not louder, just different. Someone paused mid-sip of coffee, head tilted, listening without admitting he was listening. After a moment, he lowered the cup and said nothing. Engines changed. Machines were temperamental. Another delay followed, then another. Small gaps opened in the pattern of the morning, each one narrow enough to step over without comment. Each one easier to ignore than to name. The clerk's logbook began to show more white space between entries, the handwriting drifting slightly to the right. At the radio desk, the operator finally spoke again, unable to keep the strain from his voice. "There's a lot of noise out there." "Well, it's a busy day," someone replied with a thin smile. The operator did not return the smile. He put the headphones back on, turned the dial past where it should have been, and listened into the hiss as if listening harder could pull meaning out by force. No one ordered him to stop. No one ordered him to report. The building continued its routines. Papers moved, stamps fell. Men stood, sat, stood again. Words like soon and shortly and any minute now floated through the room, light as dust. The signs were there, scattered and unremarkable, hiding inside the normal shape of the day. And because they did not shout, because they did not demand, they were allowed to remain exactly what they appeared to be. Nothing urgent. Time began to behave differently without announcing the change. It no longer stretched evenly from minute to minute. It gathered in pockets. 10 seconds would pass unnoticed, and then a single second would seem to linger, heavy enough to feel. The clock on the wall kept its rhythm, but the men in the room started checking it more often, as if it had quietly become unreliable. The officer with the folder stood near the table now instead of sitting. He had not decided to stand. He had simply found himself on his feet, weight shifting from heel to toe. He adjusted the folder under his arm, then set it down, then picked it up again. Each movement suggested purpose. None of them produced it. A runner appeared at the door and waited without being told. His breathing was faster than it should have been for a short walk. When the clerk looked up, the runner shook his head once before a question could be asked. "Still nothing," he said, already backing away as if lingering might make the absence heavier. The clerk nodded and wrote nothing. At the radio desk, the operator had abandoned careful adjustments. He turned the dial further than regulation allowed, listening into frequencies he was not supposed to need. The hiss thinned suddenly, just enough to reveal a voice beneath it. The voice was strained, clipped, fighting distance. "Repeat. Cannot confirm." The operator froze, afraid movement might lose it. He leaned closer, his mouth almost touching the microphone, and spoke with deliberate calm. "Say again." Slowly. There was a pause. Not static this time. Silence. Then the hiss returned, thicker than before, swallowing whatever had been trying to come through. The operator straightened and looked around the room. For the first time that morning, several men were already watching him. "That sounded like," someone began. "Like nothing clear," the officer said smoothly, stepping in before the sentence could finish. His tone was firm without being sharp. It closed the space where questions might have formed. The operator nodded once, too quickly. He wrote a note anyway, folding the paper and sliding it under the edge of his pad instead of placing it on top. Across the room, the map had drawn a small crowd. Fingers pointed, traced, hovered. No one spoke above a murmur. A man with thinning hair tapped a location twice with the eraser end of his pencil. "If there's any delay here," he said carefully, "it compresses everything that follows." "Only if it's a real delay," another replied. "We don't know that it is." The pencil stopped tapping. A telephone rang. The sound cut through the room, sharp and sudden. Several men flinched. The clerk reached for it, hesitated, then lifted the receiver. "Yes," he said, listening. His expression did not change. He nodded once, said yes again, and hung up. For a moment he kept his hand on the phone as if expecting it to ring again. "Well?" someone asked. "Wrong extension," the clerk said. They were looking for transport. A few men exhaled at once, annoyed more than relieved. The lamps burned steadily now, but the room felt darker. Outside, light had dimmed further, or perhaps the men had simply become aware of its absence. The blackout curtain was adjusted again, then left alone. No one wanted to draw attention to the window. A chair scraped back. The officer took 2 steps toward the door, then stopped. He stood there listening to sounds beyond the room. Boots, voices, the echo of a corridor that carried more urgency than it used to. "We should check," someone said quietly. Not quite a suggestion, not quite a request. "Check what?" the officer asked. The man opened his mouth, closed it, and shrugged. "Just check." The officer nodded slowly. He placed the folder back on the table, aligning it with the edge, and smoothed the top page with his palm. "In a moment," he said. "Let's give it a moment." The moment arrived and passed without ceremony. At the radio desk, the operator caught another fragment. This one clearer. Too clear. "Cannot hold." The rest was lost, but the 2 words hung in his ears long after the sound faded. He removed the headphones and stood, the chair legs protesting loudly against the floor. "I think we need to," he began. The officer turned toward him, not sharply, but fully. His eyes held the operator's, steady and unblinking. "We need to wait for confirmation," he said. "Speculation won't help anyone." The operator swallowed and nodded. He sat back down, more carefully this time. The clock's second hand passed the same number again. Someone noticed that it was closer to the hour than they had realized. A man checked his watch and then checked the wall clock, comparing them like witnesses whose stories might not match. A document was brought in, stamped and signed, routine and necessary. It was placed on the table, reviewed, and added to the pile. The act felt absurdly normal, and that normality was its own kind of comfort. Outside, the engine stopped. The sudden absence of sound was more unsettling than noise. Conversations trailed off. Heads turned toward the walls as if listening through them. "They're probably conserving fuel," someone said quickly. "Of course," another replied, too fast. The radio hissed without pause, indifferent to reassurance. The officer finally moved again, this time toward the door. He opened it, spoke briefly to someone outside, and closed it just as quickly. When he returned to the table, he did not sit. "They're checking a relay," he said. Nothing unusual. No one asked how he knew. The room settled into a tighter silence. Men stood closer together now without noticing they had moved. Papers lay untouched. Pens rested on desks. Even the habitual match rolling had stopped. There were still things that could be done, calls that could be placed, messages that could be sent, questions that could be asked. They all existed in the space between one breath and the next, and as that space narrowed, no one quite recognized it as the last open window. It happened without ceremony, without sound loud enough to mark it. A clerk reached for the stamp he had used 100 times that morning and pressed it down on the paper in front of him. The rubber met ink. The stamp met paper. The dull thud was identical to all the others that had come before it. He lifted it, checked the impression, and slid the document into the outgoing tray. The tray was full. He paused, noticing that for the first time, and then set the paper on top anyway. It bent slightly under its own weight, the corner catching on another page. He straightened it, aligning the stack with the care of a man finishing a task rather than beginning one. At the radio desk, the operator removed his headphones. He did not announce it. He simply set them down beside the receiver, the cord coiling loosely like it had gone slack on its own. He rubbed his palms together, once, twice, as if warming them, though the room was not cold. "You want me to try again?" he asked, not looking at anyone in particular. The officer did not answer immediately. He was reading a line on the folder's top page, his finger following the words as if he needed help keeping his place. When he reached the end, he nodded, more to himself than to the room. "No," he said, "not yet." The word "yet" landed heavier than intended. It implied sequence. It implied that something had already moved into position. At the map table, a ruler was lifted and set aside. The metal edge made a faint ringing sound as it touched the wood, a small, clean note that hung in the air longer than it should have. The man who had been tracing routes folded his arms and stepped back, giving the map space as if it were finished with him. "That's it then," he said quietly. No one challenged him. No one asked what he meant. A telephone rang down the corridor and was not answered on the first ring. When it was finally picked up, the voice that answered was sharp with apology. The call was short. When the receiver was placed back on its cradle, it made a louder sound than usual, plastic against plastic. A man near the door checked his watch again. This time he did not adjust it. He simply looked at it, then let his arm fall to his side. "We're past the window," he said, not loudly. The officer looked at him. For a moment it seemed like he might argue. Instead he inhaled, slowly through his nose. "The window was always narrow," he replied. "We knew that." The sentence was meant to reassure. It did not. Outside, the engines started again. Not all at once. One, then another, then several more, each coming to life with its own rhythm. The sound layered itself, filling the space beyond the walls until it became a constant presence, too complex to separate into parts. A vibration passed through the floor, subtle but undeniable. Cups rattled in their saucers. A lampshade trembled and then stilled. No one commented on it. The radio crackled briefly. The operator's hand twitched toward the receiver, then stopped halfway. He clenched his fingers into a fist and let them rest on the desk. The clerk closed his logbook. The motion was small, final. He pressed the cover flat, slid the book to the side, and stacked a fresh pad of paper in front of him out of habit. After a second, he realized there would be no need for it. He left it there anyway. A runner appeared in the doorway, breathless, eyes wide with information he did not yet have words for. He took in the room, the stillness, the way no one was moving toward him, and hesitated. "Well?" the sergeant asked. The runner swallowed. "They're moving ahead of schedule." "Ahead," the officer repeated, testing the word. "Yes, sir." "How far?" The runner shook his head. "I don't know. They just said, ahead." The officer nodded once. "Thank you." The runner did not leave immediately. He lingered as if expecting further instruction, then realized none was coming. He backed out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. Silence followed, denser than before. A man laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that escaped him before he could stop it. He covered his mouth with his hand, embarrassed, and looked around as if to apologize. "Habit," he said. "Nerves." No one acknowledged him. At the map table, someone reached out and erased a small pencil mark near the edge. The eraser left a pale smudge. The paper beneath it roughened and thinned. The man stared at the blank space where the mark had been, then set the eraser down carefully, as if it might be needed again. It would not be. The officer gathered the papers from the folder and returned them to their place. He tied the string around it, looping it twice, pulling it snug. The knot sat centered, neat and deliberate. "That's all we can do," he said finally, not as an excuse, as a statement of fact. The radio hissed on. The operator turned it down just a fraction, lowering the noise to a level that could be ignored without being silenced entirely. The hiss remained, a reminder rather than a demand. A door somewhere in the building slammed shut. Another opened. Boots moved with purpose now, no longer pretending to stroll. Voices carried commands that were not shouted, because shouting was no longer necessary. The men in the room found themselves standing closer to the walls, to the table, to one another. No one sat. No one suggested sitting. A thin crack appeared in the window glass, barely visible, like a hair laid across it. The man nearest noticed it and frowned, touching it lightly with his fingertip. The glass was intact. The crack did not widen. "Probably old," he said, to no one. The officer checked the time. He did not announce it. He placed his watch back in his pocket and straightened his jacket, smoothing the fabric down the front as if preparing to leave, though he did not move toward the door. Outside, the engine settled into a steady roar. Not hurried, not frantic, committed. Inside, nothing else changed. No alarms sounded, no orders were shouted. No final warnings arrived too late to matter. Only the quiet understanding, shared and unspoken, that a line had been crossed so gently, it had felt like standing still. And there was no step that could take them back across it. The room reached a kind of stillness that did not belong to buildings. It was not silence. The radio continued its low hiss, thinner now, as if even the static were conserving itself. The engines outside maintained their steady rhythm, no longer starting or stopping, just existing, a sound that had settled into permanence. Somewhere deeper in the structure, a beam creaked and then went quiet again, like a body adjusting its weight. No one spoke. The men stood where they were, caught between the instinct to move and the understanding that movement would not change anything. A hand rested on the back of a chair without pulling it out. Another hovered near a telephone that did not ring. A cigarette burned down unnoticed, the ash lengthening until it finally broke and fell to the floor in a soft gray line. Breathing became something people were aware of. Slow inhales, careful exhales, as if the air itself were limited and had to be shared properly. The clock's second hand continued its work, but it no longer felt like counting forward. It felt like circling, returning again and again to the same narrow stretch of time. Each tick landed with the same quiet certainty. No hurry, no pause. At the radio desk, the operator sat perfectly still, hands folded in front of him. He did not reach for the headphones again. He understood that whatever came next would not need amplification. His eyes were fixed on the space just above the receiver, unfocused, listening to something that had not yet arrived. The clerk stared at the closed logbook. For the first time that day, he did not feel the urge to open it. There would be nothing to write that belonged to procedure. He placed his palm flat on the cover, feeling the familiar texture, grounding himself in an object that had always meant continuity. The officer remained standing at the center of the room. His posture was straight, composed, almost formal. He had the appearance of a man waiting to be addressed. His gaze moved once around the room, not checking, not supervising, simply seeing the faces as they were now, stripped of routine. Outside the window, the light thinned further, not dark yet, just reduced, as if the world were quietly dimming itself in preparation. The crack in the glass caught that fading light and briefly shone, then disappeared again. A distant sound traveled through the walls, not loud, not close. A sound without shape, without detail, easy to mistake for thunder or heavy wind if one wanted to. No one named it. No one reacted. The engines did not change their pitch. Someone swallowed. Someone else shifted a foot and then stilled it again, annoyed at the noise. The match that had been rolled all morning lay forgotten on the table, finally at rest. Time narrowed. It felt compressed, drawn tight, as if the room were being pulled toward a single point just beyond its walls. Every second that passed seemed to lean forward, balanced on its edge, unwilling to fall. The radio hiss faltered for a fraction of a moment, then resumed. The clock reached the top of the minute, and for the briefest space between 1 second and the next, everything held its breath, suspended exactly where it was, waiting for what would arrive when waiting was no longer possible.